Let me tell you something before I begin. Most people who've been publicly destroyed don't get to tell their story. They disappear. They move somewhere smaller, get a job that doesn't require references, and they spend the rest of their lives flinching every time someone brings up their hometown. Most people who've been made into a villain in front of their entire school, in front of every teacher, every coach, every parent who ever watched them play, they don't recover from that. They absorb it. They fold it into themselves like scar tissue, and they carry it everywhere they go, invisible and permanent. I was 17 years old the night they put my face on a screen the size of a gymnasium wall and told 1,500 people that I had thrown a game for money. 17. I want you to really sit with that for a second, because I need you to understand the weight of what I'm about to tell you. Not as a story about revenge, not even as a story about justice, but as a story about what it costs a person to become someone the world cannot ignore. And I want to be honest with you from the start. There was a cost. There is always a cost. And by the time I'm done talking, you'll understand exactly what I paid. But first, let me tell you what happened in that auditorium. And then let me tell you what I did about it. I grew up in a town that smelled like pine resin and cold water. Upstate New York, the kind of place that doesn't make the news unless there's a blizzard or a factory closing. Population 14,000 on a good day. 2 high schools, 1 public, 1 private. And everyone who mattered in that town sent their kids to Lakeview Academy, the private one, the one with the indoor ice rink. My family was not that kind of family. My father drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery chain. He left at 4:30 in the morning, 6 days a week, came home smelling like cardboard and exhaust, ate whatever my mother had left in the oven, and fell asleep in the recliner before 8. He wasn't unhappy about this. He was proud of it in the way that certain men are proud, quietly, without announcement, without asking for acknowledgement. He'd grown up in a family that lost things, and the fact that we didn't lose things felt like enough. I think about my father a lot when I think about where I came from. He was not an emotional man in the demonstrative sense. He didn't hug easily, didn't verbalize things, didn't have a vocabulary for feelings that I could borrow. But he was a man of rigorous consistency. Same route every morning, same order of operations when he got home. Washed his hands before dinner, always. Checked the weather on the small television in the kitchen while he ate, always. And on Sundays, when he didn't work, he sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down the family's budget for the coming week. Not because he didn't have it memorized, but because he believed the act of writing it made it real and accountable in a way that thinking about it didn't. I watched him do this from the time I could sit at that table, and I absorbed something from it that I've never been able to fully articulate. The discipline of reckoning, the integrity of counting what you actually have rather than what you wish you had. My mother was different, warmer, more present in the daily texture of things. She cleaned houses 3 days a week, not a cleaning service, just herself with her own supplies, driving her own car to the homes of people who were comfortable enough not to want to scrub their own bathrooms. She kept a calendar on the refrigerator with client names written in her careful looping hand, the Murphys, the Parkers, the Baileys. Later, I would learn that some of those names belonged to families with kids at Lakeview Academy. I never told her what happened between me and one of those families' sons. I never wanted her to feel the specific humiliation of that particular irony. She also cooked. I don't mention this because it's quaint. I mention it because the kitchen was the place in our house where I understood most clearly that we lived in a world organized around scarcity made beautiful by effort. She could take a cheap cut of meat and a bag of dried beans and produce something that tasted like it had cost 4 times what it had. I am not romanticizing poverty. I am trying to tell you something accurate about the texture of the life that produced me, careful, warm, real, and built on the understanding that nothing was given and everything had a cost, and the way you handled both of those facts was a measure of who you were. We were not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not a miserable child. I had the rink, and I had the numbers, and I had parents who were stable and present in the way that matters most. But I understood, from very early, that the world was organized in a way that did not neutrally distribute its advantages. And I understood, again, in the way children understand things, in the gut rather than the brain, that the path from where we were to somewhere better would have to be built by hand, piece by piece, without anyone clearing the way. I started skating when I was 5. There was a public rink on Colfax Street, open on weekends, admission $4 for kids under 12. My father took me every Saturday morning for 2 winters. He didn't know how to skate himself. He'd grip the boards and shuffle forward while I went in circles, getting faster each week. I don't remember the exact moment I fell in love with it. I just remember that the ice felt like the one place where my body understood exactly what to do. There's something I've heard athletes describe as flow state, that condition where the activity and the mind are so perfectly synchronized that the self-consciousness dissolves, and you're just moving, just reacting, just being entirely present in what you're doing. I found that on ice at age 6. I didn't have language for it. I just knew that after 2 hours on the rink on Saturday morning, I felt clean in a way I didn't feel anywhere else. By 8, I was playing in a city recreational league with gear from the thrift shop and skates my mother had bought at a church sale and had professionally sharpened to pretend they were new. By 10, I was the best player on my team. Not bragging, just accounting. The coach of my rec league team was a volunteer named Adam Bailey, who also coached his daughter's soccer team and kept a clipboard with everyone's ice time recorded to the minute for fairness. And Adam Bailey told my parents, with the slightly embarrassed enthusiasm of someone reporting something they can't explain, "I've been doing this for 11 years, and I've never seen a kid his age with these instincts." By 12, I'd been scouted by a traveling club coach named Theodore Cox, Coach Cox, who told my parents he thought I had real potential, not NHL potential. He was careful about that. He said real potential, and my parents heard exactly what they wanted to hear, and I heard something different. I heard, "You belong somewhere." What Cox saw, and I understand it now better than I did then, was not raw talent in isolation. He saw the combination of physical instinct and cognitive attention that distinguishes a good athlete from an exceptional one. I watched the game differently from other players my age. While most goalies track the puck reactively, I was reading the offensive structure, watching where players positioned themselves before the play developed, predicting where the shot was coming from before it was released. This is not an innate gift. I had spent hundreds of hours in the public library reading sports manuals and statistical analyses because my family couldn't afford video software, and because the library was the only research institution I had access to. I built my game from books the same way my father built his budget with a yellow legal pad, systematically, carefully, with the resources that were actually available rather than the ones I wished I had. Coach Cox ran the youth program at Lakeview Academy. The school offered scholarship positions on the hockey team, not tuition scholarships, but gear allowances, facility access, reduced program fees, for exceptional players from the public school system. It was the kind of arrangement wealthy institutions create to give the impression of meritocracy while maintaining careful control of who benefits. I qualified for one of those positions when I was 13, and I accepted it immediately, and I didn't fully understand until much later what it meant to be the scholarship kid on a team where every other player's parents belonged to the booster club. I chose to play goaltender, not because anyone told me to, because I watched a goalie in a travel league game when I was 11, a kid named Ethan, big, for his age, who stopped 17 of 18 shots in a loss. And I saw the way the position worked. You were the last line. Every mistake on the ice eventually ended with you, and every save started with you. There was a strange kind of control in that. An accountability I understood even then, even at 11, even in the way a kid understands things. Not intellectually, but in the gut. The position also suited something in my temperament. Hockey goalies are the most exposed people on the ice and simultaneously the most protected. You're the only player whose job is purely defensive, the only one who stands at the end and absorbs everything that arrives. You cannot run the puck up the ice. You cannot create offense directly. All you can do is hold the line again and again until the people in front of you do their part. There is something in that structure that made sense to me in a way I couldn't fully articulate until I was much older. It fit the experience of being the kid who didn't own the tools, who didn't have the connections, who couldn't change the rules of the environment he'd entered, but who could refuse to let the puck get past him. I think there's a version of my whole life in that metaphor. I've thought about it enough times that I'm not sure anymore if it's insight or rationalization. Maybe both. By the time I was 15 and playing for Lakeview's junior varsity team, I had a .912 save percentage and had read every book in the school library about sports statistics, not because anyone assigned them, because I wanted to understand what the numbers meant, what they couldn't measure, where the gaps were between what the stats said and what actually happened on the ice. Coach Cox noticed. He moved me up to varsity early, my sophomore year. Unusual. The older kids didn't love it, but they accepted it because I made stops that kept them in games, and hockey players are ultimately pragmatic about results. That was the world I lived in. Disciplined, focused, small, mine. I didn't have money. I didn't have connections. What I had was the ice and the math and the patience to show up every morning at 5:30 for practice before school, every day for 4 years without once asking for recognition. I should have understood sooner that quiet excellence and institutional power don't negotiate equally. Lakeview Academy looked like a college campus, red brick buildings connected by covered walkways, a proper theater, a new science wing, a fitness center that would have embarrassed some small universities. The main building had a clock tower. The clock tower had a functioning bell. The bell rang on the hour every day, and I remember standing outside it the first morning of my freshman year, looking up at it, feeling the way a person feels when they've been let into a room they weren't born to be in. The hallways were different from my middle school. Everything was quieter in a specific way, not silent, not subdued, but controlled. Students moved with the confidence of people who had never been told they didn't belong somewhere. Teachers spoke to them like colleagues in training. There was a particular posture that wealth creates in teenagers, a kind of relaxed certainty, like the world will arrange itself around you if you just give it a moment. I didn't have that posture. I'd worked to unlearn the flinch that comes from growing up in a house where every expense is considered before it's approved. I wasn't ashamed of where I came from, but I was acutely aware, every day, of the distance between what I was and what surrounded me. The hockey team was the central social institution of Lakeview. This is not an exaggeration. The team's games were covered in the local paper. There were banners in the gymnasium. The Booster Club held galas. The Booster Club, a formal organization of parents who fundraised and advocated and, in practice, decided far more about the team's direction than anyone, officially acknowledged. The Booster Club was led, in all but title, by a man named Gerald Sullivan. Gerald Sullivan was not officially the Booster Club president. He was its largest donor. There is a meaningful difference between these two things, and also, in practice, no difference at all. He had made his money in commercial real estate, strip malls, storage units, the unglamorous infrastructure of regional commerce. He drove a black Mercedes, wore fleece vests year-round, and had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes because his eyes were always calculating something. His son was Blake Sullivan. Blake was our captain. I want to describe Blake carefully, because I think it matters. Not because I want to be fair to him, but because, understanding him, is part of understanding what happened. Blake was not stupid. People who do what he did are sometimes portrayed as stupid, and that's a comfortable fiction. Stupid people are easier to dismiss. Blake was averagely intelligent, athletically gifted, and socially brilliant in the specific way of people who have never been forced to develop substance, because charm has always been sufficient. He was tall. He had his father's smile, that same calculation made personable. He knew how to read a room. He knew when to be loud and when to be quiet, when to put an arm around a teammate and when to freeze someone out. He was good at hockey, not exceptional. He was a strong skater, a physical presence, a passable passer. His defensive reads were mediocre, but he compensated with aggression, and aggression at the junior level covers a lot of technical deficiencies. He would not have been captain on a team built purely on merit. He was captain because his father paid for the team's new jerseys, the team's travel, the renovation of the locker room. He was captain because in institutional environments, money creates entitlement that then masquerades as leadership. I knew all of this. I accepted it the way scholarship kids at private schools learn to accept the mechanics of the institution they've entered. You understand the rules. You don't pretend the rules are fair. You play within them because the alternative is to leave, and you don't want to leave. Blake and I were not enemies at first. We were not friends. We existed in adjacent spaces with a mutual understanding of our different relationships to the team. He needed my saves. I needed his tolerance. This is not camaraderie, but it functions. The friction started my junior year. We'd had a strong season, 8 wins, 2 losses, and there was talk from Coach Cox and from parents of regional recognition, of scouts, of the kind of exposure that creates futures for young players. The district championship was a genuine possibility, and somewhere in the logic of that possibility, the question of credit became important. After our 7th win, a reporter from the local paper came to do a piece on the team. She spoke to Coach Cox. She spoke to Blake. She spoke to a few other players. She did not speak to me, which was standard. Goalies are rarely the story. But the article she wrote included a line that I have never forgotten. The Lakeview Eagles are built on the vision and leadership of their captain, Blake Sullivan, son of prominent local businessman Gerald Sullivan, who has donated extensively to the school's athletic program. One sentence that encoded everything about how the institution saw itself and its players. My save percentage wasn't mentioned. My name wasn't in the article. And that was fine. I didn't need the article. But it was the first time I understood, consciously and clearly, that in this particular ecosystem, the story of the team would always be Blake's story, and I would always be part of the supporting structure. I remember thinking, that's fine. As long as the saves count, I should have thought further. Let me tell you about the game. It was January, the 3rd week of January, a Tuesday, which was unusual. But our home and away schedule had been rearranged because of a facilities issue at the other school. We were playing Harmon Prep, a school from a district about an hour south of ours. They were our closest competition in the region. 2 strong teams, high stakes, parents traveled. The bleachers at Harmon's rink were full. I had been playing the best hockey of my life that month. My save percentage over the previous 3 games was .941. I had stopped a penalty shot in the final minute of our last game that the team had genuinely celebrated. Not the polite acknowledgement goalies usually get, but actual celebration, arms around me, helmets knocked against mine. Even Blake had nodded at me after that save. One of those compressed nods that meant something. The game at Harmon was physical. Their forward line was fast and aggressive. Their center, a kid named Jacob from memory, had a shot that I had studied on film the week before, a slightly late release on his wrist shot that I needed to compensate for. I stopped him twice in the second period. Both times it required positioning adjustments that were invisible to most of the crowd, but that I'd spent 4 hours working out in practice. We won 2-1. My save count was 22 stops. It was objectively one of the best performances of my junior year. On the bus ride back, the team was loud and easy in the way of teams that have just won a hard game. Music from someone's phone, chips being passed around, Blake in the front, holding court with the first line forwards. I sat near the back, as I always did, with my headphones in. I wasn't antisocial. I just needed quiet after games to decompress. The hypervigilance of playing goal takes a long time to come down from. The bus driver was a man named Samuel Barnes. He'd driven us all season. A quiet, careful man in his 60s who always kept the bus warm and never played the radio without asking if it was okay with the boys. I'd exchanged maybe 40 words with him over the course of the year, but I'd noticed him the way I noticed details. His brown work gloves on the steering wheel, the small photo taped above the visor, the way he checked his mirrors with a rhythm that felt like breathing. I fell asleep somewhere around the 40-minute mark of the drive home. I don't know what happened on that bus after I fell asleep. I do know what I woke up to 4 weeks later. The announcement came on a Thursday morning in February, a mandatory all-school assembly. This was not unusual. Lakeview held assemblies periodically, usually for guest speakers, occasionally for awards, sometimes for administrative announcements. The auditorium held all 1,500 students, faculty, and a section reserved for parents who had been specifically notified. I didn't know parents had been notified. I walked in with a couple of teammates, Ethan Ward, Lucas Barnes, a few others, and found seats. Maybe a third of the way back from the stage, the auditorium was already nearly full. I noticed the energy was different from a normal assembly, tighter, more still. Teachers were standing along the walls. The principal was at the podium. Gerald Sullivan was seated in the front row of the parent section. I saw him because he was hard to miss. That posture of controlled authority, the fleece vest, the deliberate stillness of a man who knows why he's in the room. I did not understand yet why I was in the room. The principal spoke for 3 minutes about integrity, about the school's values, about the trust that institutions place in their students and that students place in each other. Standard language. The kind of words that precede a specific thing without naming it. And then a screen descended from the ceiling above the stage. And then the screen lit up. The footage was from a security camera mounted inside the team bus. Something I hadn't known existed. A wide-angle fisheye, lens grainy in the way of internal vehicle cameras, mounted near the front. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., the night of the Harmon game. I was in the back of the bus, and in the footage you could see my shape, hood of my jacket pulled up, head tilted toward the window, apparently asleep. And then you could see a figure moving toward the back. Then you could see what appeared to be, and I want to be precise about this, what appeared to be my hand reaching toward someone in the aisle, and what appeared to be an envelope exchanging between us. And then that person moving forward again. The figure in the aisle was wearing Harmon prep colors. The implication was immediate, complete, and devastating. I heard the sound the room made before I fully understood what I was seeing. A 1,500-person collective intake of breath, then murmuring, then voices. I felt eyes on me before I had processed the logic of what was on the screen. Human attention has a physical quality when it is hostile. I don't know how to describe it except as pressure, like a change in elevation. The principal returned to the podium and said that the school had received compelling evidence of potential misconduct related to the Harmon game. He said that an investigation was being initiated. He said that pending the outcome of the investigation, certain student athletes would be placed on suspension from all school activities. He said my name. He said only my name. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand. I just remember being vertical, in the middle of the auditorium, surrounded by 1,500 people who were now looking at me, and I said, and my voice was steady, which I'm still surprised by, I said, "That footage has been altered." The principal looked at me for a long moment. A teacher near the aisle took a step toward me, and from the front of the room, without standing, without raising his voice, Gerald Sullivan turned and looked at me over his shoulder. That look, I've thought about it many times in the years since. It was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was the look of someone watching something move exactly the way they'd arranged for it to move. Blake was seated in the section reserved for team leadership. I looked at him. He was looking at his hands. I sat down. The assembly ended 7 minutes later. Put in the comments what you would have done in that moment. Because standing up was instinct. I've never been sure it was the right choice. What happened in the next 72 hours was the kind of thing that in another era would have taken weeks to unfold. In 2012, smartphones, local Facebook groups, parents texting each other, it took 3 days to become a complete catastrophe. The suspension was formal and immediate. I was not allowed on school property for extracurricular activities. My scholarship, the gear allowance, the facility access, the reduced program fees, was suspended pending investigation, which in practical terms meant immediately terminated because the investigation would drag past the season's end and there would be nothing left to reinstate me to. My family's phone number, which I still don't know how anyone found, started receiving calls. Not many, maybe a dozen, but enough. Hang-ups at 2 a.m. One voicemail that I listened to once and then deleted and have never been able to fully forget. My mother found out about the voicemail before I could intercept it, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface for a long time without saying anything. My father asked me once, directly, looking at me with the particular expression of a man who has worked too hard to have his integrity questioned by proxy, "Did you do what they're saying?" I said no. He nodded, and then he went back to eating dinner, and that was the last time either of my parents asked me about it directly. They believed me, they just had no mechanism to help me, and they knew it, and the knowing was its own kind of damage. I think about that dinner often, the way we ate in near silence, my mother moving around the kitchen with the particular, controlled efficiency of a woman who has no outlet for what she's feeling, and so puts it into physical tasks. The way my father held his fork. The ordinary, devastating normalcy of a family that has just been publicly accused of something and has no recourse except to keep eating dinner. What I remember most vividly about those weeks, and I know this sounds like a strange thing to focus on, is the physics of avoidance in a small school. The way human beings reroute themselves around a person who has become socially contaminated. It's not conscious for most of them. They're not thinking, "I should avoid him." They're thinking, "I need to get to class," and the fastest route that doesn't require acknowledging something uncomfortable is this one. Human social behavior is largely automatic, and the automatic setting is to reduce friction, and I was friction. At school, what time I spent there for academics, I was a person who did not exist. This is the thing people don't fully capture when they talk about social ostracism. It's not that people are hostile. Hostility requires engagement. What happens is that you become invisible. Conversations stop when you approach. Eye contact is withheld. You are simply not factored into the social math of the space. Ethan Ward, who I'd sat next to on the bus for 3 years, started taking a different route between classes to avoid walking past my locker. I noticed this on the 3rd day. I noticed when Lucas Barnes, who had once brought me soup when I had the flu before a practice, walked by me in the cafeteria without looking up. I remember sitting at a table alone one Thursday, eating a sandwich my mother had packed with the same care she always packed it, the good bread, the careful cut on the diagonal, and watching the cafeteria function around me as if I weren't there, and feeling not anger, but something closer to grief. A 17-year-old's grief for the specific, irretrievable thing that was. The morning before the assembly, I'd sat at this same table with Ethan and Lucas and two others from the team, and someone had been laughing about something, and for a moment, the ordinary warmth of belonging had been so normal that I hadn't even noticed it. 24 hours later, I was eating the same sandwich in the same room, and the room had become a different place entirely. And Blake was giving interviews. He sat for a piece in the school paper that was later picked up by the local news. He spoke about the culture of integrity in the program, about how the team had worked so hard to get to where they were, about how it was heartbreaking when someone made a choice that tarnished what they'd all built together. He did not name me in those interviews. He didn't need to. The school had named me in the assembly. The naming was already done. What I noticed about Blake's interviews, even then at 17, even through the haze of what was happening to me, was their structure. He never said anything specific. He never made a falsifiable claim. He spoke in the language of feelings. Heartbroken, disappointing, hard to process, and in the language of institutional loyalty. The team, the program, everything we've built. Every word was calibrated to produce an impression without committing to a fact. I recognized it as sophisticated even at 17. I understood it for what it was, protection architecture, the language of someone who knows exactly what he's done and has designed his public presentation to be unfalsifiable. The coach, Theodore Cox, who had recruited me, who had moved me to varsity early, who had praised my save percentage to scouts, who knew what I brought to that team every single morning at 5:30, said nothing publicly. He released a statement through the school's communications office saying that the program took matters of integrity very seriously and that he supported the administration's process. I have carried that statement like a stone in my chest for a long time. He knew. I believe, and have believed since the night of the assembly, that Coach Cox knew something about how that footage was produced. I don't have proof of this from the beginning. The proof came later, in a form I will describe. But there was something in his specific silence that told me it wasn't neutrality. Neutrality looks different from complicity. I had watched enough games to know the difference. The investigation concluded 6 weeks after the assembly. They interviewed me once for 45 minutes in a conference room with the principal and the athletic director and a lawyer who never introduced himself and who took notes without speaking. I told them the footage was edited. I told them I'd been asleep. I told them I did not know anyone on the Harmon team and had no contact with any of their players before or after the game. I told them they should bring in a forensics expert to examine the original video file. They did not bring in a forensics expert. The conclusion of the investigation was that the evidence was inconclusive, but significant enough to warrant the disciplinary measures already enacted. Translation: we're not finding you guilty, but we're not clearing you either, and the measures remain in place. I wasn't expelled. I finished the school year. I graduated that June, standing in a robe on a lawn with 700 other students, receiving a diploma from a principal who shook my hand without making eye contact. My family attended. My mother cried. My father shook my hand afterward, the same way the principal had, except my father's grip was hard and real and told me something the diploma didn't. I left for college in September. I did not say goodbye to anyone from Lakeview except my mother's friends. Daughter, a girl named Courtney Parker, who had never been part of the hockey world and who texted me, "I know it wasn't you." 3 words. I saved that text message until my phone broke 2 years later. I need to tell you about the mistake, because the story doesn't work without it and I don't believe in telling it without it. The mistake happened the January of my freshman year of college. I was at a state school on a partial academic scholarship, not an athletic scholarship because my athletic record was radioactive, studying finance, with the vague idea that I would somehow build something, though I couldn't yet say what. I'd been in contact, over the fall semester, with a former player from Lakeview, a guy named Cody Ward, who'd been 2 years ahead of me on the team and had always been decent to me. He reached out on social media after the assembly to say something like, "That's messed up for what it's worth." We'd stayed loosely in touch. In January, Cody told me he'd spoken to a friend of his, someone who did video production work, who claimed he could probably determine if the bus footage had been edited, given the original file. Cody said his friend wanted $500 for the analysis. I had $237 in my bank account. I borrowed $300 from my father. I told him it was for textbooks. I gave the $500 to Cody to pass to his friend. The friend disappeared. Cody, to his credit, seemed genuinely embarrassed. He'd been deceived too, I believe, but the money was gone. My father's $300 was gone, and I had nothing to show for it except the lesson that desperation makes terrible decisions available that patience would have declined. I spent 3 weeks in a very dark place after that. Not dangerously dark, I want to be honest without being melodramatic, but the particular darkness of someone who has tried to fight back and instead made themselves more vulnerable. I'd wasted my family's money on a ghost. I'd confirmed to myself that I had no leverage, no resources, no reliable allies. I almost transferred to a school closer to home. I almost called Coach Cox, I had his number still, and demanded something, anything. I almost posted about what had happened on every platform I could access. I didn't do any of these things. Not because I was strategic, because I was exhausted. Exhaustion kept me still long enough for the stillness to become something else. The 3 years after college began were the quietest of my life in the way that deep water is quiet. Still on the surface, tremendous pressure underneath. I finished my finance degree. I was a good student. Focused, relentless with coursework. The kind of student who visits office hours not to ask for help, but to probe whether the professor knows something the textbook left out. I graduated with a 3.89 GPA and a minor in statistics, not because I needed the minor, because the statistics courses were the closest the university offered to sports analytics, a field that in 2015 was still emerging and still undervalued, and I had been thinking about it since I was 15 years old, reading numbers at the public library. I want to tell you what those 4 years of college actually looked like, because I think the version of this period that gets told in retrospect, the driven young man building toward something, flattens the reality considerably. The reality was lonelier and less certain and often considerably darker. I had no athletic identity in college. At Lakeview, even under the cloud of the assembly, I had still been someone who was identifiably good at a specific thing. The team knew what I brought. The stats existed. The saves were real and recordable. In college, I was just another freshman in the finance program, anonymous in the most complete way, which is the anonymity of someone who has not yet had a chance to perform. I tried out for the club hockey team my freshman year. Club, not varsity. I made the team. I played. I was, objectively, one of the better goalies in the club league, and this produced in me a very specific kind of grief that I didn't fully understand until years later, the grief of someone who could see clearly what they had been denied. Because I was good. I was still good. And I was playing club hockey for 40 people in a half-empty auxiliary rink on Tuesday nights, instead of the varsity program I'd been on track for, because a video had been shown in an auditorium, because an institution had failed to look carefully, because a sponsor's son had needed something covered. That grief, I want to be honest about this, that grief is what made the long years possible. Not rage, not a burning sense of injustice, not the kind of cinematic anger that people imagine powers this kind of story, just grief, a quiet, specific, recurring grief for a timeline that had been diverted and a version of myself that didn't get to exist. I think grief is actually a more powerful motivator than rage in the long run. Rage exhausts itself. It burns hot, and then it needs fuel to keep burning, and feeding it is expensive in every sense. Grief is patient. Grief doesn't need anything. It just sits with you and waits, and in the waiting it clarifies what you actually value and what you're actually willing to do about it. I finished my finance degree. I was a good student, focused, relentless with coursework, the kind of student who visits office hours not to ask for help, but to probe whether the professor knows something the textbook left out. I graduated with a 3.89 GPA and a minor in statistics. Not because I needed the minor, because the statistics courses were the closest the university offered to sports analytics, a field that in 2015 was still emerging and still undervalued, and I had been thinking about it since I was 15 years old reading numbers at the public library. I got a job at a financial services firm in Albany, junior analyst position, $80,000 a year, which felt like an enormous amount of money until I understood what it actually bought, in a city where I was renting a studio apartment and paying off student loans. I wore the same 3 suits for 2 years, alternating ties. I ate lunch at my desk 4 days a week. I stayed until 8 most nights, not because anyone required it, but because I was learning everything the job could teach me about how money moved, how funds were structured, how investors thought about risk and return and time horizons. The office was a particular kind of education that no classroom provides, not because of what the work itself taught me, though the work taught me a great deal, but because of what I learned watching the senior people in that environment operate, how they made decisions, which decisions they made quickly and which slowly, how they communicated confidence without certainty, how they read people. I was a decent analyst, but I was an exceptional observer, and I treated those first 3 years in Albany as a graduate seminar in institutional power, conducted without the institution's awareness that I was taking notes. I also maintained, throughout those years, a quiet personal practice that I've never described to most people. Every 6 months, I updated what I privately called a timeline, a simple document, on paper, not digital, that tracked everything I knew about the key figures from the Lakeview situation. Blake's career moves, Cox's coaching appointments, the status of the school's athletic program, the Booster Club's publicly accessible activities, Gerald Sullivan's business activities, drawn from public filings and local newspaper coverage. I didn't update it out of obsession, I updated it out of discipline, the same way my father wrote his budget on Sundays, not because he didn't know the numbers, but because the act of writing them kept them real, accountable, and visible rather than abstract. I was also reading everything I could find about the sports industry, about franchise valuations, about media rights, about the infrastructure of professional leagues, how teams were owned, how they were financed, what the actual numbers looked like underneath the spectacle. Sports had always been numbers to me. Now I was learning to see them as assets. I saved aggressively, not dramatically. I wasn't living on rice and beans. I wasn't depriving myself in theatrical ways, but I tracked every dollar. I invested conservatively with what I had. I understood from the financial models I was building at work that time and consistency did more than genius, and that the most important thing was not to break the chain. I thought about Blake Sullivan, not obsessively, not in the way that's corrosive, not in the way that takes up residence in your chest and poisons your sleep. I thought about him the way a navigator thinks about a destination, clearly, factually, with updated information about distance and trajectory. I'd tracked him loosely through public channels. He'd been drafted by a minor league affiliate in his early 20s, not a first-round pick, not anything that made headlines, but solid enough. He was playing. His father had maintained his involvement with youth hockey programs, still funding things, still present at the kind of local institutional events where presence is currency. The investigation at Lakeview had produced nothing. No accountability. The school had moved on in the way institutions always move on from internal scandals, with time and silence, and the tacit cooperation of everyone who benefited from the original arrangement. I let them move on. I watched them move on. I waited. Here's what I want to ask you. Drop it in the comments. If you had no money, no power, and no allies, how long would you have been willing to wait? I left Albany when I was 26 for a position at a private equity firm in New York. Sports-focused, which was still a niche sector in 2018, but was growing fast as institutional capital was beginning to take professional sports seriously as an asset class. The firm, I'll call it a name I won't specify, specialized in minority stake acquisitions in mid-market professional franchises, the kind of club that isn't a marquee property but produces consistent revenue and has strong regional brand equity. I was hired as an analyst. I was promoted to associate in 14 months. My specialty was the valuation models, specifically developing financial frameworks for assessing sports franchises that traditional PE methodology undervalued. Most private equity firms looked at sports clubs and saw a leisure business with unpredictable revenues and celebrity-inflated costs. I looked at them and saw media rights residuals, real estate adjacency, fan base as a loyalty ecosystem, and regional monopoly dynamics that made the risk profile very different from what the standard DCF models suggested. I was right about this in ways that took my firm 2 years to fully appreciate and 2 more to act on. I was also building something on the side, not large, not visible, just consistent. I had started investing in small sports data companies, the kind of early-stage analytics firms that were selling subscriptions to college coaches and minor league front offices. I understood their product because I'd wanted their product when I was a kid reading statistics in a library. I knew what questions coaches actually asked, which metrics had predictive validity, where the existing tools were failing. I made 4 investments between 2017 and 2020, ranging from $8,000 to $40,000, and 3 of them returned capital, and one of them, a hockey analytics platform that was acquired by a sports media group in 2021, returned 22 times my initial investment. I am telling you this not to boast. I am telling you this because I want you to understand how the mechanism worked. Not a lottery, not a moment of brilliance. 4 bets, 1 big win, reinvestment of proceeds into the next round, and the slow accumulation of a position that was not yet significant, but was no longer nothing. By my late 20s, I had a network in sports finance that was genuinely valuable. Not famous, I was not a name anyone mentioned in public, but I was someone that certain kinds of people called when they needed someone who could look at a sports asset and understand it structurally. That invisibility was intentional. I had learned, from watching Gerald Sullivan operate, that real institutional power rarely announces itself. The people who announce themselves are managing their own uncertainty. The people who are truly powerful don't need the room to know they've arrived. I also hired a therapist when I was 27. I want to say this plainly because it matters to the story. Not a dramatic breakdown, nothing like that. A deliberate choice. I had recognized in myself a pattern that I didn't want to compound. The tendency to make decisions from a place of injury rather than from clarity. The Cody Ward money was an example. There were others smaller. Moments where my judgment was being colored by something that wasn't strategy. It was the 17-year-old standing up in the auditorium, still trying to be heard. The therapy didn't fix me. That's not what therapy does. It gave me a way to locate the difference between the injury and the calculation. Both were present. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but I could learn to know which one was in the driver's seat. That knowledge would become important later. I need to tell you how the pieces came together, because I think people imagine these things happen the way they happen in films, with montages and dramatic music and clear turning points where the hero pivots and acts. That's not how it works. What actually happens is, you spend years building infrastructure that could serve multiple purposes, and then the moment arrives when you choose which purpose to serve. By the time I was 31, I'd left the PE firm and launched my own investment vehicle, A small fund, 8 limited partners, 18 million in committed capital, focused exclusively on sports asset acquisition and sports media. Not a large fund by industry standards, but a coherent one with a clear thesis. And in my sector, a clear thesis is worth more than scale. The fund's name was quiet, deliberately quiet. Our operating structure was designed for discretion, SPVs for each acquisition, limited public-facing presence, maximum flexibility. Some of this was standard PE structure. Some of it was intentional opacity that I had designed for reasons my limited partners didn't need to know, and I didn't offer to explain. I'd been watching Blake Sullivan's career for years. Not stalking, I want to be precise here, tracking. There is a difference. Public records, publicly accessible game logs, league websites, press releases, local paper coverage. Blake had played in the minor leagues for 7 years, bouncing between 2 or 3 affiliates at the AHL level. He was a roster piece, useful enough to keep, not exceptional enough to elevate. He was 32, which in hockey terms means the conversation about the future is happening whether you want it to or not. I had also been, for 2 years, paying a quiet retainer to a firm called Digital Integrity Consultants, a digital forensics company that did legitimate work for insurance companies and law firms, including historical analysis of manipulated video evidence. The firm had no idea who I was. I was a client managed through an intermediary. Their mandate included a review of several dozen historical cases of alleged misconduct in youth amateur sports, which they were working through systematically as part of a published research initiative. One of those cases was the Harmon Prep game. I had not asked them to prioritize it. I had not told them what to find. I had simply ensured they had the file, a copy of the security footage that I had obtained through a legal records request from the school district's archive, which had digitized it as part of a document management initiative. I had made that records request through a separate intermediary. The chain was clean. The third piece was Samuel Barnes. Finding Samuel Barnes took 6 months of patient work through a private investigation firm. He had retired from the school district transport service and was living in a small town in Vermont, where he kept a garden and occasionally drove part-time for a senior transport service. The investigator I'd hired, a woman named Dana Richardson, who specialized in locating witnesses in institutional proceedings, located him through public retirement records. I had not approached him yet. I was not ready to approach him yet. The fourth piece. I was in the final stages of negotiating a minority stake acquisition in a minor league hockey club that shall remain unnamed, except to say that Blake Sullivan was on its roster, on an expiring contract, and had just signed a letter of intent for a new deal that was pending final board approval. My fund was seeking to acquire a 12% stake in this club from a limited partner who was exiting. 12%, non-controlling, no operational authority, just a board seat and financial visibility. That was all I needed. Board membership in sports franchises comes with information rights, access to financial records, player contract structures, endorsement deal disclosures, the internal mechanics of how the organization manages its liabilities. I wasn't there to run the team. I wasn't there to influence personnel decisions directly. I was there to see the documents and to be in the room. The acquisition closed in the spring. I attended my first board meeting in April. Blake Sullivan was at practice, 30 feet from the conference room, where I sat at a mahogany table with 4 other investors and the team's president and general manager, discussing the season's financial projections. He had no idea I existed, not yet. The media acquisition was the piece that took longest to arrange and that I am most proud of. Not because it was clever, though I think it was, but because it was the thing that required me to think beyond my own situation. I purchased a controlling stake in a small sports media platform called Apex Sports Review. It was a digital native outlet. streaming, podcast, YouTube-driven, with a small but loyal audience focused on amateur and minor league sports coverage. They had good production values, a committed editorial team, and a specific beat that no major sports media outlet was adequately covering: corruption and institutional failure in non-professional leagues. The kind of stories that happen constantly and never get told because there's no business model for covering them at the level they deserve. I liked the outlet's mission. I also recognized it as the instrument I needed. I did not tell the editorial team what to cover. This is important. I am not a person who fabricates things or manufactures outcomes through deception, or at least I am not willing to be. What I did was fund them to do the work they were already committed to doing, more thoroughly and with more resources than they'd previously had. I hired a documentary producer, a serious, careful journalist named Alicia Hughes, who had spent a decade covering institutional sports corruption, and I told her to develop a series examining historical manipulation cases in youth amateur leagues across the Northeast. I told her about the DIC firm's research. I put them in contact. I told her there were interesting cases in their dataset. I told her to find the truth, whatever it was, and I told myself, and I want to be, transparent about this, because it's the honest version of the story, that if the truth didn't support what I believed, I would stand down. I would release the board seat. I would let it go. That was the deal I made with myself. I want to tell you I was entirely certain the truth would be what I believed it was. I was not entirely certain. I was very confident. But there is a distance between confidence and certainty, and that distance is where integrity lives or dies. I had chosen a side. I had also chosen to let the evidence lead. Alicia and her team spent 11 months on the Harmon Prep segment alone. She interviewed former players, parents, administrators. She worked with the DIC forensics team on the video file. She located the metadata trail of the original security footage, the school's IT system logs, which had been digitally archived and were accessible through state public records law, and found something specific and devastating. The footage that had been shown in the auditorium had been processed through a third-party editing application between 11:53 p.m. on the night of the game and 12:41 a.m. the following morning. The original file showed no activity in the rear of the bus during that window, consistent with an envelope exchange. The edited file had been created on a workstation registered to the school's athletic department. The workstation was assigned to the assistant coach. The assistant coach, at the time of the editing, reported to Theodore Cox. And then, and this is the part that I could not have scripted, the part that arrived through Alicia's reporting and not through my planning, she found a second witness. Not Samuel Barnes, though we did eventually speak to him. A parent who had been in the parking lot at Harmon Prep after the game, who recalled seeing a figure in Harmon Prep colors, speaking with a man near the team bus before the bus left. A figure who had subsequently boarded the Harmon team's bus, not ours, who had, in other words, never been on our bus at all. The envelope exchange in the video was fabricated, not just edited, fabricated. Someone had sourced footage from another source and inserted it. I read Alicia's report on a Thursday evening in October, sitting alone in my apartment, and I held it for a long time without moving. Then I called Alicia and told her it was the most important piece of journalism her outlet had produced, and that I wanted it ready for release in 60 days. Blake signed his new contract in the second week of November. There was a small announcement in the league's press release system, a 2-year deal at a figure that wasn't disclosed publicly, but that I could see in my capacity as a board member. It was not a generous contract. It was the kind of deal a team gives a veteran player they're not fully committed to, structured with outs, performance clauses, a signing bonus that front-loaded the value. Blake gave an interview to a local sports podcast that week. The host asked him about his career trajectory and about what had kept him going through a journey that had its ups and downs. Blake spoke, and I want to be accurate here because I have listened to this interview multiple times. Blake spoke about perseverance, about character, about how the game teaches you things about yourself that nothing else can. He talked about integrity. He used the word integrity. I was ready. The Apex documentary series had been building audience for 8 months by then. 3 previous episodes on corruption in youth sports, fixing in wrestling, grade manipulation in football recruiting, financial fraud in travel baseball, had generated substantial attention. The platform's subscriber base had grown significantly. The journalism was being taken seriously in the ways that matter. Other outlets were citing it. Legal organizations were referencing it. A state athletic oversight body had requested consultation. The 4th episode aired on the 2nd Tuesday of December. It opened with the original Lakeview bus footage, the actual original, with forensic markers indicating its integrity, and then showed the altered version side by side. The forensics team explained, in language anyone could understand, exactly what had been done: the timestamp manipulation, the inserted frames, the metadata irregularities. They identified the specific editing software. They traced the file to the school workstation. The episode named the assistant coach. It did not accuse him. It presented the evidence and noted that he had declined to comment. It did not name Blake Sullivan or his father. There was no direct forensic evidence connecting them, and Alicia was rigorous about her evidentiary standards. But the episode described the relationship between the Booster Club leadership and the administration's response, the speed with which the suspension had been enacted, the failure to conduct an independent forensic review, despite the implicated player's explicit request. The episode named me. It told my story in my own words. I had agreed to an interview for the documentary, conducted months earlier under terms that the school and the league wouldn't have anticipated. It was the first time, in 14 years, that my version of events had been told in a format that anyone could see. By Thursday morning, the episode had been viewed over 300,000 times on the platform. By Friday, 2 regional sports outlets had picked up the story. By the following Monday, the state's High School Athletic Association had announced a review. Coach Theodore Cox released a statement through a lawyer. The statement said he had no knowledge of any manipulation of evidentiary materials related to the Lakeview investigation. The statement was notable primarily for what it didn't say. The assistant coach, I'll call him by the name the records eventually confirmed, a man who had worked under Cox for 3 years and left the district 8 months after the assembly, did not release a statement. Gerald Sullivan had his lawyer send a letter to Apex Sports Review, asserting that the documentary contained defamatory implications against his family. Alicia and our legal team reviewed the letter and responded with the full evidentiary file. No defamation action was filed. Blake, as far as I could see, said nothing publicly. The financial piece was the quietest part. It was also, in terms of material consequence, the most decisive. Blake's endorsement portfolio was modest: a regional equipment brand, a supplement company, and a local car dealership. Not the kind of deals that make careers, but the kind that make a minor league salary livable. Combined, they probably added 30 to 40% to his annual income. In my capacity as a board member of the club, I had access to the documentation surrounding his contract disclosures. Endorsement deals for players under standard league agreements are required to be disclosed to the team for conflict of interest review. The disclosures Blake had submitted were technically compliant, but contained irregularities. Specifically, one of the endorsement relationships had been structured through an intermediary LLC in a way that obscured the actual financial flow. Not criminal, not even clearly against league regulations, but the kind of irregularity that, when flagged by a board member with documented concerns and a request for a formal compliance review, triggers a process. I flagged it, formally in writing at a board meeting. in the language of a fiduciary with a legitimate concern about disclosure standards. The compliance review was initiated by the league's oversight body, not by me. I didn't control that process. I simply created the condition under which it was initiated. The supplement company, the one with the most significant dollar value in his endorsement portfolio, had a morality clause in their agreement, as all reputable brand partnerships do. The clause was triggered not by the financial audit, but by the reputational environment created by the documentary. Their legal team reviewed the public attention around Blake's former teammates' vindication and the renewed questions about the Harmon game, and they determined that continued association created brand risk. Blake's endorsement contract with the supplement company was terminated in January. 3 weeks later, the equipment brand followed. Their termination letter, which was a matter of public record in a subsequent filing, cited changed circumstances in the public profile of the endorsed individual. Without endorsement income, Blake's total compensation fell below the floor of what made his lifestyle sustainable. He had been living in the way that people in his financial bracket often do, against expected income rather than actual savings. The structure was fragile. The income disruption was not. Blake requested a meeting with the team's general manager in February to discuss his situation. The GM, a practical man who had not been part of the original acquisition and had no relationship with me outside of board meetings, told Blake that the team would honor his existing contract but could not commit to the second-year option under the current circumstances. Blake was effectively a lame duck player, under contract until the season ended, with no renewal on the table and no endorsement income, in the middle of a reputational situation that was still being actively covered. And that is when he asked for a meeting with my investment group. He didn't know it was me. That's the detail I need you to understand. Blake Sullivan, at 33, was reaching out to any capital source that might be interested in backing a sports entrepreneurship initiative he was developing. A vague proposal that combined youth hockey instruction with personal brand development. He had the proposal circulating through agents and intermediaries who moved in sports investment circles. My fund was one of several that received it. I accepted the meeting. I want to be honest about my internal state in the weeks before that meeting, because I think the truth of it matters, and because it's the part of the story that doesn't fit cleanly into either the hero narrative or the cautionary tale. I was not calm. I was not dispassionate. The discipline I had built over 14 years had not erased the 17-year-old standing up in the auditorium. It had just given him resources. He was still there. He was present in the specific controlled tension I felt reading Blake's meeting request, and in the deliberate care with which I prepared. I prepared for that meeting the way I used to prepare for big games, film study, every publicly available interview Blake had given in the past 2 years, his presentation materials, which the intermediary had forwarded, the team's recent board minutes, which I had access to. I read everything. I constructed a clear picture of where he was, financially pressed, reputationally damaged by the documentary, but not yet connecting it to anything that involved me directly, looking for a lifeline. I prepared what I wanted to say. I wrote it out, not because I would read from it, but because writing forces precision in a way that thinking doesn't. The words went through 4 drafts. I wanted them to be accurate. I wanted them to be calm. I did not want them to be cruel, not because I was protecting him, but because cruelty would have made it about his pain rather than about the truth. I had never wanted it to be about pain. I'd wanted it to be about the record. We met in a conference room at my firm's office in Manhattan, 10th floor. January, gray outside, the East River visible from the window. Blake arrived in a gray suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, the kind of suit bought for an earlier, less stressful version of your life. He looked older than I'd expected, though he shouldn't have. 14 years is a long time. We were both older. He didn't recognize me immediately. I had changed more than he had, in the ways that working in finance for a decade changes a person. I wore it differently, spoke differently, occupied space differently. The scholarship kid from the back of the bus was not legible in the person sitting across from him. I had also deliberately presented myself through the intermediary, under the fund's name rather than my own, our standard operating procedure for early-stage meetings, but useful here for reasons that were not standard. I let him present for 12 minutes. He was actually decent at presenting, that social intelligence still there, marshaled into a competent pitch. He talked about his career, his passion for youth development, his platform in the regional hockey community. He had statistics. He had projected enrollment numbers for the youth program. He mentioned, briefly and without details, that he'd had some external challenges recently that he was working through. He framed this with the kind of careful vagueness I recognized from his interviews at 17. Nothing specific, nothing falsifiable, the language of implication rather than fact. I let him finish. I sat with the silence for a moment. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just long enough for the silence to be its own statement. Then I slid a folder across the table. Inside the folder were 3 things: the restored original bus footage, the clean version, the one with forensic authentication markers, printed as stills with timestamps, a copy of the DIC forensic report, and Samuel Barnes' witness statement, in which the bus driver confirmed that on the night of the Harmon game, after the players had disembarked at the school, Blake Sullivan and Theodore Cox had remained on the bus alone for approximately 25 minutes before leaving separately. Blake looked at the folder for a long time without touching it. I watched his face. I had wondered for many years what that moment would look like, the moment of recognition, and I can tell you that it looked like a man becoming very still, not shocked, not angry, not defensive. The first response was pure stillness, the kind of stillness that arrives when the body needs a moment to redistribute what it's carrying. Then he looked up at me, and I saw the moment, the specific, unmistakable moment when recognition arrived. Not pleasant recognition, not the reunion kind, the kind that reorganizes a person's understanding of what the last 30 minutes meant, and what the last 14 years meant, and what the next 30 seconds were going to require of them. "You," he said. Just the word. "Me," I said. He sat with this for a moment. I could see him processing, running through the timeline of the documentary, the board seat, the financial audit, assembling the picture. Blake was not stupid, and the architecture of what I had built was not subtle once you had the key. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was controlled. I'll give him that. "Nothing from you," I said. "I don't need anything from you. The documentary is out. The forensics are public. The review is ongoing. None of that requires your participation." "Then why are you—" "Because I wanted you to know," I said. "Not because I needed you to know. Because I chose to let you know." I stood up. I had written 4 drafts of the next part. In the end, I used the simplest version, because simple is honest, and honest is what this moment required. "You once gave an interview about integrity in sports," I said. "Several of them, actually. I kept them." I gestured toward the folder. "I just made sure you played by the same rules you talked about." I left him in the conference room. I took the elevator down alone and walked out into the January cold, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the street. Not triumphant, not relieved. Something more complicated than either. Something that felt like completion and loss at the same time. So completely fused I couldn't separate them. Like the end of a very long project that you have organized your life around, and the project is done, and now you have to figure out what you organize your life around next. I stood there for maybe 3 minutes. Then I got into a cab and went back to work. The State High School Athletic Association's review concluded 7 months after the documentary aired. Its findings were formal, precise, and thorough in the way that institutional documents are thorough when they are trying to manage liability while still arriving at truth. Theodore Cox was permanently banned from coaching in any school-affiliated athletic program in the state. The specific language of the findings cited failure to ensure the integrity of disciplinary processes and improper use of administrative authority. There was no criminal finding. The statute of limitations on anything actionable had long expired, but the professional consequence was complete and permanent. The former assistant coach, who had been working in a different district by then, resigned his position before the review's conclusion. He has not, as far as I can determine, returned to coaching. The school, Lakeview Academy, issued a formal statement of regret regarding the handling of the 2009 investigation, noting that procedural failures had led to outcomes that did not reflect the school's values. They stopped short of an apology. These things rarely produce apologies. Institutions protect their surfaces. But the statement was there, in public, permanent, searchable. Gerald Sullivan was not named in any formal proceeding. There was no direct evidence connecting him to the production of the altered footage. His son's name was not in the forensic report. These are facts I have to live with. The clearest villain, in my understanding of the story, was also the one most insulated from consequence. But Gerald Sullivan's relationship to youth hockey in our region was irreversibly changed. The documentary episode had described, factually and without editorializing, the dynamics of the booster club, the speed of the administration's response, the pattern of institutional deference to major donors. People who wanted to draw conclusions could draw them. The reputational ecosystem had shifted. He stepped back from the booster organization within the year. Blake Sullivan played out the remaining 2 months of his contract. When the season ended, no club offered him a new deal. He announced his retirement in April in a social media post that described hockey as having given him everything, and that he looked forward to the next chapter. His proposed investment was not funded by my group or, as far as I could determine, by anyone else. I heard through the network of people who track these things without anyone asking them to, that he moved back to the town where we grew up, that he was working in some capacity related to his father's real estate business, that the arc had curved back to the place it had started, just with the shine removed. I thought about that. I thought about whether it was enough, whether anything was enough. I told you at the beginning that there was a cost. I told you I would be honest about it. Here it is. I am 34 years old. I run a fund that manages approximately $65 million in assets under management and growing. I have a board seat on 2 sports franchises. I have a media platform that is doing serious journalism. I have relationships in finance and sports that took a decade of sustained, disciplined work to build, and those relationships open doors that money alone cannot open. I live alone. I have had relationships, serious ones, meaningful ones. I am not someone who cannot connect, but there is something in me that was calcified in that auditorium at 17 and has never fully softened. Not anger, I want to be precise. Not rage, not bitterness, not the kind of pathology that makes people lonely because they can't stop being furious. Something quieter and more structural, a core assessment that arrived the day I was made a public villain before everyone I knew, and that I have never entirely been able to revise. That the systems people trust to protect them are primarily interested in protecting themselves, and that the only reliable source of security is the kind you build yourself, quietly, over a very long time. That assessment has made me excellent at my job. It has made me a genuinely thoughtful investor. It has made me someone who reads institutions carefully and quickly, and doesn't miss things that more trusting people miss. It has also made intimacy complicated in ways I can describe, but not fully fix. Here is the specific shape of it. Because I think generalities are a form of avoidance. When someone gets close enough to matter, I become aware of my own contingency in the relationship in a way that is hypervigilant and exhausting. Not jealousy, not insecurity in the conventional sense, but a kind of background monitoring that never fully quiets. A part of me always calculating the ways the ground could shift, the ways trust extended could be exploited, the ways the relationship could end and what it would cost. This is not romantic. I am aware it is not romantic. It is the interior life of someone who learned at 17 that institutions you trust can burn you in public and the people around you will reroute to avoid the heat. I went through a serious relationship in my late 20s, a woman named Molly Price, who was thoughtful and direct, and who had the specific kind of patience with other people's complications that comes from having worked through her own. She lasted 2 years before she told me, with the honesty I had valued in her, that she didn't know how to love someone who had already decided the relationship was temporary. "You're not here," she said. Not literally. She didn't mean I was physically absent. She meant, you've already built the wall against the ending, and the wall is so solid that I can't tell if there's anything real behind it anymore. She wasn't wrong. I think about Molly sometimes in the same way I think about the photograph in my desk drawer, as evidence of something that existed before the infrastructure, before the architecture of self-protection had been fully built. She deserved more than what I could give her then. I'm not sure I can give more now. That's the honest version. The therapist I've worked with, I still see her, less frequently now, has a way of naming things I'm doing before I've finished doing them, which is both her value and the most uncomfortable thing about the relationship. She once said to me, "The infrastructure you've built to protect yourself from being harmed again is real and solid and effective. The question is whether you've left a door." I think about that sentence more than I think about the conference room with Blake. I have one very close friend, a man named Peter Flores, who went to college with me, who was never involved in sports, who knows the full story and has never treated me like the story is the most interesting thing about me. He asks after me. He makes me eat actual meals. He is the kind of person who costs you nothing to be around because he has no agenda. I have one close professional colleague, a woman named Samantha Cooper, who runs the analytics side of my fund and who is, quite simply, the best person I've ever worked with. She has never asked me why I care so specifically about certain kinds of sports governance questions. She has simply done excellent work alongside me for 6 years. Those two people are my inner circle. That is a small inner circle for a person my age. Some nights I think I won, completely, cleanly. The footage is vindicated. The Tatier coach is gone. The captain is finished. The documentary exists and has been watched by people in dozens of states and has contributed to at least 3 other institutional reviews of youth sports misconduct that I'm aware of. My name, searchable now, does not resolve to the school assembly. It resolves to the fund, to the media platform, to the work. And some nights I think, I was 17 years old, standing up in an auditorium, and I told the truth, and no one helped me. And I've spent 14 years becoming someone who didn't need anyone to help me. And that trajectory has produced outcomes that I value and am proud of. But the kid who was 17 and needed help and didn't get it, and had to become all of this because he didn't get it, I'm not sure he ever entirely recovered. I'm not sure those two things, winning and recovering, are the same thing. I believed for a long time that they were. I don't believe that anymore. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think it was worth it? Not the outcome. I think we both know the outcome. I mean the cost. Is there a version of this story where he comes out on the other side whole? I keep a single photograph in my office. Not at the front of the office, not displayed. In a drawer of my desk, inside a folder. A photograph from a game my junior year. I'm in full goalie gear, mask up, looking at something outside the frame. My glove hand is out at my side. My posture is the posture of someone entirely at ease in the space they're in. I was 17 in that photo. I was good. I was doing the thing I had worked for years to do in a place that let me do it. And for that afternoon, nothing was complicated. I don't look at it often. I keep it because I think forgetting where you started is its own kind of loss. You spend so much effort becoming who you have to become that you can lose track of who you were before you had to become anything. The boy in that photograph wanted to stop pucks. He was very good at it. He was going to be very good at it. He became someone who decides who gets to step onto the ice. That is the thing about power built on old wounds. It is real. It works. It produces outcomes that nothing else could have produced. I do not regret building it. I do not wish the path had been shorter, because a shorter path would have been a different person's path, and a different person would not have done what needed to be done. But if I could go back, and of course I cannot go back, and this is the part of the calculation that no financial model captures. If I could go back to the morning after the assembly, to the family kitchen, to my father's face across the table and his hands that didn't know what to reach for, I would want someone to have helped us. Not much, just one person with a forensics background, and 2 hours and the willingness to look at the file. Just one administrator willing to say, we should verify before we act. Just one teammate, willing to stand up in the auditorium and say, I know this isn't true. One person. That's all it would have taken. 14 years of becoming invulnerable, against the cost of one person in the right moment doing the obvious right thing. I've thought about this as I've built the fund, as I've funded the journalism, as I've worked on the cases that the documentary series has brought to light. All of those other kids, in other auditoriums, in other gyms, in other moments where institutions failed them and no one helped. I think about them specifically. I try to be, in some capacity, in whatever form my infrastructure allows, the person who could have changed the path. It's not redemption. I don't believe in that word in this context. It's something more like paying a debt forward to strangers who don't know they owe me anything, which they don't, which is the point. Blake Sullivan is in our hometown. Theodore Cox is banned from coaching. The footage exists, verified, clear, permanent. I decide who steps onto the ice. I am sitting in an apartment on the 10th floor of a building in New York, and outside the window is the city that I came to with 3 suits and borrowed money and a set of ideas about how power works and who gets to wield it. And I have built exactly what I came here to build. I am complete. I am certain. I am also, in the very specific quiet of this evening, entirely alone with what it cost me. I wouldn't undo it. I just think you should know what it costs. If you stayed until the end, and I mean really stayed because this was not a short story, drop something in the comments. Tell me, at what point would you have broken? At what point would you have given up, or gone public too early, or done something that burned it all down before it was ready? Because that's the real question underneath all of this. Not what I built, how long I was willing to wait before I built it. And if you've ever been in a room where someone put your name on a screen and told everyone who you were and got it completely wrong, you know what this story costs before I even finished telling it. That's all.